Welcome to today's session. We will be discussing consumer decision-making. Decision defined every day, each of us makes numerous decisions concerning every aspect of our daily lives. However, we generally make these decisions without stopping to think about how we made them and what is involved in the particular decision-making process itself. In the most general terms, a decision is the selection of an option from two or more alternative choices. In other words, for a person to make a decision, a choice of alternatives must be available. On the other hand, if the consumer has no alternatives from which to choose and is literally forced to make a particular purchase or take a particular action, then this single no-choice instance does not constitute a decision. Such a no-choice decision consumer decision produces an image of an individual carefully evaluating the attributes of a set of products, brands, or services and rationally selecting the one that solves a clearly recognized need for the least cost. What are the levels of consumer decision-making? On a continuum of effort ranging from very high to very low, we can distinguish three specific levels of consumer decision-making. 1. Extensive problem solving. 2. Limited problem solving. And 3. Routinized response behavior. Now let's explain them. Extensive problem solving. When consumers have no established criteria for evaluating a product category or specific brands in that category or have not narrowed the number of brands they will consider to a small, manageable subset, their decision-making efforts can be classified as extensive problem solving. At this level, the consumer needs a great deal of information to establish a set of criteria on which to judge specific brands and a correspondingly large amount of information concerning each of the brands to be considered. Limited problem solving. At this level of problem solving, consumers already have established the basic criteria for evaluating the product category and the various brands in the category. However, they have not fully established preferences concerning a select group of brands. Their search for additional information is more like fine-tuning. They must gather additional brand information to discriminate among the various brands. Routinized response behavior. At this level, consumers have experience with the product category and a well-established set of criteria with which to evaluate the brands they are considering. In some situations, they may search for a small amount of additional information. In others, they simply review what they already know. Just how extensive a consumer's problem-solving task is depends on how well established his or her criteria for selection are, how much information he or she has about each brand being considered, and how narrow the set of brands is from which the choice will be made. Clearly, extensive problem-solving implies that the consumer must seek more information to make a choice, whereas routinized response behavior implies little need for additional information. This brings us to the next concept of discussion: models of consumers' decision-making. The term models of consumers refer to a general view or perspective as to how and why individuals behave as they do. Specifically, we will examine models of consumers in terms of the following four views. 1. Economic view. 2. Passive view. 3. Cognitive view. And 4. Emotional view. Let's explain. The first is the economic view. It is observed that in the field of theoretical economics, which portrays a world of perfect competition, the consumer has often been characterized as making rational decisions. This model, called the economic man theory, has been criticized by consumer researchers for a number of reasons. To behave rationally in the economic sense, a consumer would have to be aware of all available product alternatives, be capable of correctly ranking each alternative in terms of its benefits and disadvantages, and be able to identify the one best alternative. Realistically, however, consumers rarely have all of the information or sufficiently accurate information to make the so-called perfect decision. Consumers operate in an imperfect world in which they do not maximize their decisions in terms of economic considerations, such as price-quantity relationships, marginal utility, or indifference curves. Indeed, the consumer generally is unwilling to engage in extensive decision-making activities and will settle, instead, for a satisfactory decision, one that is good enough. Now, let's talk about the second, passive view. This is quite opposite to the rational economic view of consumers. It depicts the consumer as basically submissive to the self-serving interests and promotional efforts of marketers. In the passive view, consumers are perceived as impulsive and irrational purchasers, ready to yield to the aims and into the arms of marketers. At least to some degree, the passive model of the consumer was subscribed to by the hard-driving super salespeople of old, who were trained to regard the consumer as an object to be manipulated. The principal limitation of the passive model is that it fails to recognize that the consumer plays an equal, if not dominant, role in many buying situations, sometimes by seeking information about product alternatives and selecting the product that appears to offer the greatest satisfaction, and at other times by impulsively selecting a product that satisfies the mood or emotion of the moment. Now, the third is the cognitive view. It portrays the consumer as a thinking problem solver. Within this framework, consumers frequently are pictured as either receptive to or actively searching for products and services that fulfill their needs, enrich their needs, and enrich their lives. The cognitive model focuses on the processes by which consumers seek and evaluate information about selected brands and retail outlets. Within the context of the cognitive model, consumers are viewed as information processors. Information processing leads to the formation of preferences and, ultimately, purchase intentions. The cognitive view also recognizes that the consumer is unlikely to even attempt to obtain all available information about every choice. Instead, consumers are likely to cease their information-seeking efforts when they perceive that they have sufficient information about some of the alternatives to make a satisfactory decision. As this information processing viewpoint suggests, consumers often develop shortcut decision rules, called heuristics, to facilitate the decision-making process. They also use decision rules to cope with exposure to too much information, that is, information overload. The fourth is emotional view. Although long aware of the emotional or impulsive model of consumer decision-making, marketers frequently prefer to think of consumers in terms of either economic or passive models. In reality, however, each of us is likely to associate deep feelings or emotions, such as joy, fear, love, hope, sexuality, fantasy, and even a little magic, with certain purchases or possessions. These feelings or emotions are likely to be highly involving. For instance, a person who misplaces a favorite fountain pen might go to great lengths to look for it, despite the fact that he or she has 6 others at hand. When a consumer makes what is basically an emotional purchase decision, less emphasis is placed on the search for pre-purchase information. Instead, more emphasis is placed on current mood and feelings. This is not to say that emotional decisions are not rational. Now, let's talk about the stages of consumer decision-making. The stages include input, process, and output. Input. The input component of consumer decision-making model draws on external influences that serve as sources of information about a particular product and influence a consumer's product-related values, attitudes, and behavior. Chief among these input factors are the marketing mix activities of organizations that attempt to communicate the benefits of their products and services to potential consumers, and the non-marketing socio-cultural influences, which when internalized, affect the consumer's purchase decisions. Process. The process component is concerned with how consumers make decisions. To understand this process, we consider the psychological influences like motivation, perception, and attitudes that affect consumers' decision-making processes, that is, what they need or want, their awareness of various product choices, their information-gathering activities, and their evaluation of alternatives. The act of making a consumer decision consists of 3 stages: need recognition, pre-purchase search, and evaluation of alternatives. Output. The output portion of the consumer decision-making model concerns 2 closely associated kinds of post-decision activity: purchase behavior and post-purchase evaluation. The objective of both activities is to increase the consumer's satisfaction with his or her purchase. Let's talk about some important related concepts. We start with purchase behavior. Consumers make 2 types of purchases: trial purchases and long-term commitment purchases. When a consumer purchases a product, or brand, for the first time and buys a smaller quantity than usual, this purchase would be considered a trial. Thus, a trial is the exploratory phase of purchase behavior in which consumers attempt to evaluate a product through direct use. For instance, when consumers purchase a new brand of laundry detergent about which they may be uncertain, they are likely to purchase smaller trial quantities than if it were a familiar brand. Consumers can also be encouraged to try a new product through such promotional tactics as free samples, coupons, and/or sale prices. Next, let's talk about post-purchase evaluation. As consumers use a product, particularly during a trial purchase, they evaluate its performance in light of their own expectations. There are 3 possible outcomes of these evaluations. 1. Actual performance matches expectations, leading to a neutral feeling. 2. Performance exceeds expectations, causing what is known as positive disconfirmation of expectations, which leads to satisfaction. And 3. Performance is below expectations, causing negative disconfirmation of expectations and dissatisfaction. For each of these 3 outcomes, consumers' expectations and satisfaction are closely linked. That is, consumers tend to judge their experience against their expectations when performing a post-purchase evaluation.